Hello everyone, this is the Insert Title Show, and I'm your host, Wolf Strife. This episode is going to be just about World War One. I am doing this to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the start of World War One, so I'm just going to be talking about that for this episode. I've been kind of building towards doing this for a little over a week now, just collecting notes, trying to memorize everything, and you know, staying in the mood. Now, today is August 2nd, so yeah, there was some stuff going on back then. I think today Germany declared war on Russia, I believe, so things were really getting going now. But the actual anniversary of the start of World War One would have been on July 28th, which was Monday this week. So I did a bunch of stuff for the anniversary of that. That was pretty fun. I think I played like Toy Soldiers and the World War One levels and Darkest of Days and stuff like that. The guys got on and we actually all watched Johnny Got His Gun together on YouTube, so that was a lot of fun. Then, as you might know, I have a book I call the Famous Quote Book, which separates it from, which is different from my regular quote book. My regular quote book is just quotes that me and the guys say, so I can write down and not forget funny lines or anything. But the Famous People quote book is basically a quote book. It's just a little hobby of mine that I write down famous quotes from, history and stuff. So I was in a race against the clock to do a famous quote that a Lord Grey said on I believe, the start of World War One. He said something like, he was looking out the window and it was at night, I guess in London, and he was watching the lanterns go out. He said the lights across Europe are being put out and we won't see them again in our lifetimes. Basically, kind of an ominous premonition about what's to occur in Europe. And so I was trying to write down all of his quotes before midnight. And I think I beat the clock by about 10 seconds or so. So then after that, we all went and played Halo 3 for about 2 hours. So it was a lot of fun on the anniversary. But I just wanted to do this episode to kind of just, give anyone who cares kind of a brief overview of the entire war. So, yeah, just I hope this goes well. I guess I'll just start with my opinion. With my opinion on the name of the war. I kind of prefer to call it the Great War, just because I don't really think it's the first World War. I mean, we've had plenty of wars before this one that took place over large, vast distances. I mean, look at I believe it was the 7 Years' War, or as we like to call it in America, the French and Indian War. I mean, that was being fought all over Europe and over here in the colonies between the British and the French. I mean, that was going on all over the place. Then, of course, you got the Napoleonic Wars, which actually took place over, that's 15, 20-year time span, over much larger distances than World War One did. I mean, you had, basically every country in continental Europe being attacked and battles fought on. Portugal, Spain, France, Italy, Poland, Germany, Russia. I mean, just every major country basically having a battle fought in it. And of course, all the naval battles from all over the world. I mean, you had naval French warships fighting British warships off the coast of Brazil, India. I mean, just everywhere. Napoleon, and I think it was 1799, invaded Egypt. So that was a lot of fighting going on down there. And I do like to include the War of 1812 and the Napoleonic Wars, just because there wouldn't have been a War of 1812 if it had not been for the Napoleonic Wars. Because basically America got tired of being pushed around by the French and British, and we basically had to decide, well, or are we going to declare war on the French, or are we going to declare war on the British? And seeing how we just fought Britain like 30 years beforehand, and we kind of see Canada. Maybe we could take a slice of Canada from them. And, you know, we were kind of on friendly terms with the French. You know, we had just bought the Louisiana Purchase from Napoleon back in 1804, I believe. So we declared war on Great Britain, and it was a war that neither side really needed. So, but you know, so all that was going on over here too. So I mean, that was really a world war. But regardless, you know, what the hell would we call World War II if we didn't have to call it World War II? So I guess just for this, we can call it World War One. Alright, so basically the start of the war is kind of complicated, like most large-scale conflicts. I guess you could say it kind of goes back to the Franco-Prussian War, when well, you have to remember Germany back then was just a assortment of kingdoms and principalities. It wasn't Germany yet. So they basically all got together, mainly led by Prussia, and declared war on France. And basically proceeded to kick France's ass. I mean, the Battle of Sedan was one of the most decisive battles in history. I mean, the German army, well, I guess we can call it the German army, captured the entire French army, including their king, Napoleon III, and, I mean, captured an army of like 130,000 men. I mean, it was 130, 150,000 men. I can't really remember which, but captured the entire French army here. And that spurred a new revolution in Paris, which basically threw down the monarchy and established the Third French Republic. Oddly enough, though, that didn't end the war. I mean, the Germans still had to fight their way to Paris, and that took about 6 or 8 months. I mean, that took a while to get there, but they finally got there, and the French government surrendered Paris, and the Germans had a triumphant march through the streets of Paris, much like they would 80 years later during World War II. But this time they weren't here to stay. They just, you know, said, we beat you, so we're going to have our parade. And then the treaty they signed, I can't remember the name of the treaty, but they took the province of Lorraine and Alsace from France. And those two provinces were in eastern France, so right on the border with Germany anyway. So they took those and I believe made the French government pay them 3 billion francs, I believe. So shitload of money. Oh, and while they were in Paris, they also had the big celebration in the Palace of Versailles, in which they proclaimed King Wilhelm of Prussia. They proclaimed him Kaiser Wilhelm of the German Empire. So that was the unification of Germany and the birth of the German Empire. Now can't remember what he was. He was Secretary of State or whatever, Prime Minister or whatever of Germany, was Otto von Bismarck, who was really the Winston Churchill of his day. He was absolutely the best and most powerful diplomat in Europe at the time. Now, he started the war and he, you know, liked it. Germany had a lot to gain from it. But he was against taking Lorraine and Alsace because he knew that because that was a French-speaking province, that would really gall the French. So he knew that they would be making an enemy of France for as long as they had those provinces. So he was against that, but overruled. And then when Kaiser Wilhelm died, his son Kaiser Wilhelm II, who suffered from ADD, he was very energetic, but also lacked focus, so he liked to bounce around a bit. And he didn't get along with Otto von Bismarck, so eventually he sacked him and made him retire. But before he left, Bismarck tried to remind the Kaiser, we kind of have a peace treaty now with France, so try and keep relations smooth. And of course, Kaiser Wilhelm II didn't do that, and France and Russia ended up making a treaty that said that if Germany attacked one of them, that the other country would come to their defense. So that basically kind of encircled Germany a little bit there, because if Germany attacked Russia, well, then France would be knocking on their back door, and vice versa. So that kind of got Germany a little paranoid there. But while all that's going on, Austria-Hungary, the Empire of Austria-Hungary, kind of called the dual monarchy, was having some trouble of its own, mostly internal. Because, I mean, if you looked at a map of Austria-Hungary, you would kind of see a very diverse, area of Europe here that were all forced to be together. I mean, just look at the two top dogs there. You have Austria and Hungary. Very different countries, completely different language, pretty different culture. They also had like the Balkan countries that we have nowadays, Bosnia, Croatia, Slovenia, and all those. And they even had a piece of Transylvania, for crying out loud. It's a very diverse empire, which of course breeds not the friendliest of subjects, because each one's wanting to branch off and be ruled by their own people. Now, the Austrians tried to reconcile this by making the elites in Hungary basically equal partners, which pissed off the elites in Austria, so, yeah. But the Slavs were wanting to break off and form their own country, which they would eventually do, becoming Yugoslavia. But they were wanting to do that, so the Austrians tried to minimize that by granting them more liberties and cracking down on the worst of them. So that was kind of a powder keg waiting to go off in the Balkans. In fact, I believe in, what was it? Yeah, it was in 1878. Otto von Bismarck said in the Reichstag that Europe today is a powder keg and the leaders are like men smoking in an arsenal. A single spark will set off an explosion that will consume us all. I cannot tell you when that explosion will occur, but I can tell you where. Some damned foolish thing in the Balkans will set it off. And about 26 years later, he would be proven right, when on a trip to the Sarajevo, the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife were assassinated by a group called the Black Hand. I expect Assassin's Creed to make a game on them one of these years. But basically, they were a pro-Slav organization, supposedly supported by the Serbian military. And their goal was to break off from the Austrian-Hungary Empire and form Yugoslavia, basically. So when that happened, oddly enough, Franz Ferdinand wasn't that popular back in Austria-Hungary, I guess, because he was kind of a cool man, not very energetic and kind of a grouch. But the reason why the Serbians tried to kill him was because he was going to enact legislation that would kind of make Slav citizens more equal. And radical Serbian nationalists basically didn't like that, because they knew if that placated the Slav citizens, then they would have a tougher time breaking apart from the empire, so they knew they had to act. So they acted, and that was pretty bad. And then the ball started rolling. That was June 28th, and a month later, the war would begin. Basically, when Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia and invaded. And Russia had been keeping an eye on that area for a while. They had their goals in that region, mainly to take back Constantinople from the Turkish Empire, better known as the Ottomans. The Ottoman Empire was pretty big, but it was falling apart. The empire had been around about 600-700 years now. It stretched from Turkey to Saudi Arabia and all those places, Iraq and all there. all those places, and you know, kind of like the Austrian-Hungary Empire, each region was pretty unique and thought they could do better on their own. So they were kind of breaking apart. So while all that chaos was going on within the Ottoman Empire, Russia was thinking, well, we could probably sweep down and take the Balkans and a bit of Greece. So they put them in conflict with the Hungarians. So when Austria-Hungary invaded Serbia, Russia got pissed off about it and declared war on them, saying that they were back in Serbia. Austria and Hungary ran off to their pals in Germany saying, yo, can you back us up here? So Germany told Russia to back off, and if they didn't, then we would mobilize and get it on. But Germany knew if they did that, they would have to deal with France, and because Russia was such a large country, they knew that France would be knocking on their back door well before Russia would be involved. So they knew they had to take out France first. That's when the Schlieffen Plan came to being, which basically called for a sweeping attack through Belgium into northern France. And if it went well, they would be in the Paris and behind the Eastern French Army. While the Eastern French Army is attacking Germany, this right-wing attack will sweep in behind them, taking Paris and hit them in the ass. So, be like Sedan all over again, hopefully. So that happened, and eventually Germany had to declare war on Russia, and then they basically declared war on France declared war on Germany, and Germany moved west to try and knock out France before Russia became a problem. So they marched, I believe the Germans had 7 armies on the Western Front. 2 of them were going to be in southwestern Germany, right above Switzerland, to deal with the Eastern French armies, while 5 armies would move through Belgium and take the attack to northern France. Now, when Germany invaded Belgium, that was a big issue because Belgium was neutral, and they were also protected by the British. So when Germany did that, they not only had to deal with the Belgian army of about 100,000 men, they also got England to declare war on them. So the British dropped off their expeditionary army into France, and the British linked up with the French army, and the British were on the far left. So the French moved north to attack the Germans, and Germans kind of had a tough time getting through Belgium because of all the canals and rivers and fortresses. In fact, the Germans would not have probably gone through Belgium as quickly as they did if they had not brought up new artillery, the 420 millimeter Big Bertha guns, which leveled the Belgian forts rather nicely. So the Germans finally got into France, and some of the bloodiest engagements of the entire war were fought. First Battle of the Marne, Battle of the Frontiers, all those. I mean, those were some bloody battles. In fact, I believe August of 1914 was the bloodiest month of the entire war, actually. I think there were about 600,000 casualties. In fact, on August 22nd, that was the bloodiest day in France's history. They lost about 75,000 men, 27,000 of those were killed. So basically the German army and the French army and the British Expeditionary Force were just, running into each other, just beating the shit out of each other with artillery, machine guns, infantry, charging blindly into fixed positions. I mean, it was just a mess. So while that was going on the Western Front, on the Eastern Front, the Russians finally got 2 armies to invade Eastern Germany. And the Germans only had 1 army over there, and that was the 8th Army, commanded by Baron von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff, who were to go on to become the rock stars of the German High Command. And basically, while the German 8th Army kind of held off the Russian 1st Army, they were able to swing around and completely encircle the Russian 2nd Army. And after a few days of fighting, they were able to capture it and destroy the entire Russian 2nd Army. I believe the Russians lost about 150,000 men there. I mean, 92,000 of them surrendered, 78,000 of them were killed or wounded, about only 10,000 of them were able to escape, so Germans knocked out an entire Russian army there. In fact, it was so bad that the Russian general of the Second Army, I believe his name was Samsonov, actually shot himself in the head rather than report to the Tsar about what happened. So that was a big victory for the Germans. And but while that was going on, a couple of Russian armies invaded Austro-Hungarian territory and dealt a serious blow to them. I think about 1 million, 1.2 million Russians defeated a Austrian-Hungarian army of 950,000. Losses for both sides at the Battle of Galicia were about 500,000. About 550,000. So that was a bloodbath, but Russians dealt the Austrian-Hungarians a blow there at the Battle of Galicia. Then later on the Western Front, the First Battle of Ypres was going on, and there'd be a lot more battles fought in that town. Basically what had happened was the French finally stopped the German advance about 20 miles north of Paris, so French armies definitely had their back to the wall. So they finally stopped them and then were able to push them up north into the Belgian border. That's where the First Battle of Ypres was going on. Now the British Expeditionary Force was fighting pretty well, but by the time of the Battle of Ypres, they had lost most of their veterans. So they would need to be replaced by, FNGs, basically, fucking new guys who are being enlisted and conscripted into the British Army to help drive back the German army. So basically around this area in the French-Belgian border is where trench warfare basically came into play, because neither side could really defeat the other, so it just boiled down into that. And they basically just sat there and shot it out for 4 more years. So basically that went on until about Christmas, where there was the Christmas truce, which was a widespread unofficial ceasefire that took place between the British, French, and German troops, where they basically would walk out into the middle of no man's land and talk, sing Christmas carols, and exchange items and stuff. So that's a pretty cool story. But of course, the officers, the commanding generals, were not too happy about that, so they put a stop to that. And as the war continued on and men would lose friends and relatives, that was basically the last time anybody talked about, peace between the armies. So then 1915 came along, and 1915, oddly enough, would be the bloodiest year of the war. That's when both armies were big and strong enough to just pound away at each other, attacking basically left and right. On May 7th, 1915, the British liner Lusitania was torpedoed by a German submarine, killing almost 1,200 people, 128 of them American citizens. So that kind of started to piss us off a little bit. Then on the Eastern Front, at the Battle of Palermo, I guess is what you'd call it, the Germans used poison gas for the first time, firing about 18,000 gas shells at the Russian troops, but the poison didn't work that well, and a stiff breeze got kicked up and blew the gas back into the German lines, so That didn't go too well. But the Russians kind of thought that good time to attack and attacked, but that didn't go too well for them. They lost about 40,000 men to the German 20,000. So, like I said, it's back and forth mostly in 1915. The Germans were doing pretty well though on the Eastern Front. It was just their allies, the Austrian Hungarians, who were kind of always getting their asses kicked by the Russians. But let's see. In fact, in February of 1915, the Germans launched a major offensive into Russia called the Second Battle of Mazarin Lakes. Basically, during a blizzard, they marched 70 miles within a week, just kicking Russian ass the entire time. And they even captured the entire Russian army. So that was a pretty big deal, but the Russians were eventually able to stop them. But not before the Russians lost about 200,000 men compared to the Germans losing only 16,000. So then in April, the British launched the Gallipoli campaign. Now Gallipoli is in the Dardanelles, I believe, which is between Turkey and Greece, basically. You know, the open water there into the Black Sea, which is basically where you would go from the Aegean Sea into the Black Sea. So the goal of that was to basically take the Ottoman Empire's capital of Istanbul and then land troops into Russia to help the Russians beat back the Austrians and Germans. So it was a bold plan, but the Ottomans stopped them pretty cold there. In fact, Winston Churchill was the lead arbitrator of this offensive and of this campaign. So when it failed, he was basically fired and went to command a company on the Western Front. Not too many politicians you would see doing that, but Winston Churchill was definitely a soldier. He'd fought in the Boer War, I believe, and stuff like that. So he was definitely a tough guy. But the Gallipoli campaign was quite the disaster. They weren't able to break through and had to call it off. In Australia and New Zealand, it's revered kind of like how Texans revere the Alamo, kind of like a noble stand. And so that went on, battles like that, just going back and forth in 1915. Then when 1916 came along, first major battle of the year was the Battle of Verdun, when the Germans tried to invade France again. On February 21st, about 1.2 million Germans attacked. Things got pretty bad, especially when the Germans were successfully and quite easily taking the French fortresses, most famously when they took Fort Douaumont without losing a single soldier, I believe. And this was basically the watershed moment for the French, because if they lost this entire area, they might as well lose the whole war. So they had to stand firm. In fact, French Field Marshal Robert Nivelle said the famous line, "Ils ne passeront pas," which means they shall not pass. That was his order to the French soldiers, and eventually, after many losses, they were able to hold the Germans and then were able to push back. But Verdun was a pretty important battle. I mean, it saw the first use of flamethrowers in history, when the Germans brought those out. Flamethrower in German is Flammenwerfer, so they were able to bring those into play. Okay, they were quasi-successful. They scared the hell out of the French, who had no idea. I mean, you would just be laying in a trench and all of a sudden you're so Verdun was a pretty nasty battle. I mean, most infantry soldiers never even saw an enemy soldier. because they were mostly bogged down in trenches and artillery was the main killer of the battle, much like the war. I believe like 70% of casualties in World War I were caused by artillery, so that's that's pretty insane. I think only 1 or 2% were caused by melee weapons like bayonets and clubs and knives and stuff, so kind of crazy. But French were finally able to push the Germans out of there, thanks in large part to the British launching the Somme offensive in July, which made the Germans have to shift troops around to the north a little bit. But Battle of Verdun lasted from February 21st to December 18th, and at the end, altogether there were about 700,000 casualties, with about 300,000 dead. I think official war dead were about 200,000 with 100,000 missing, which basically meant they were either disintegrated by artillery shells or were buried in the mud, never to be found again. In fact, the battlefield of Verdun nowadays has a ossuary where every once in a while they still dig up bones of dead soldiers and they just put them in the ossuary. So it's a pretty crazy battlefield I'd like to see one of these days. Now a hill called the Dead Man saw a lot of action there. Kind of ironic name for a hill that would see a lot of battle, but there's a statue now there with kind of a dead soldier, kind of a dead skeletal soldier holding his country's flag. And the inscription at the base of the statue says, "They did not pass." So it's definitely a battlefield I would like to see, especially when, I guess you could say, that 100th anniversary of that battle is coming up in a couple of years, so might get to go and see that. And while that was going on, in June 1916, the Russians launched the Brusilov offensive, which was arguably the most successful Allied invasion of the war. The Russians, again, just bitch slapping the Austrian-Hungarians around. And that went on until September 20th, when they were finally halted, when the Russians were finally halted by the Germans. But that basically knocked the Austrians out of the war, as far as offensive capabilities went. The Russians lost almost 1.5 million men, but caused 780,000 casualties to the Austrian and Hungarian armies. And that's almost 2-to-1 loss on the Russians' part, but they could suffer that and keep going. The dual monarchy could not. Then on May 31st to June 1st, which is my mom's birthday, the only large-scale naval engagement occurred, the Battle of Jutland off the coast of Denmark. And it was really the only full-scale clash of modern-day battleships ever. And it was also the heaviest naval battle of all time if you add up the tonnage of all the ships involved. Basically, the Royal Navy, totaling about 151 ships, squared off against the German Navy of 99 ships. So there were 28 British battleships against 16 German battleships. So you can imagine those going off against each other, being pretty crazy. It was kind of more or less a stalemate. The British lost more, but Germans gained very little. So that was a pretty badass naval engagement. British lost. Let me see. They lost 3 battle cruisers, 3 armored cruisers, and 8 destroyers, and about 6,000 men were killed. So that was pretty bad. In fact, the British Admiral said there seems to be something wrong with our bloody ships today. The Germans lost 1 battle cruiser, 1 pre-dreadnought battleship, and 4 cruisers and a couple of torpedo boats. About 2,500 men were killed. So that was pretty cool. That was a good sized naval engagement. And really the last time battleships would ever go at it, seeing how in World War II, the advent of air power and aircraft carriers, you really wouldn't ever see that again. Now on July 1st, to help out their French allies, the British launched an offensive into the Somme region of France. And this offensive would last until November 18th. Now, the bloodiest day of the whole campaign was, fittingly enough, the first day, which is still the bloodiest day in British history, where they suffered about 60,000 casualties, 26,000 of them killed. I mean, in one day. Imagine that casualty figure nowadays. Now, when I say, when I'm saying casualties and killed, I'm really just saying that to show you how big this fucking war was. I mean it. I'm not just saying, these men were, not just lightly stating these men were killed or wounded. Each one of these was a man, father, son, brother, cousin. Each one of these were a life. So I'm definitely not stating these casualty figures lightly. I'm just doing it to show you how horrific this war was. And also on the Eastern Front, when all this was going on in August of 1916, the Romanians, for whatever reason, joined the war. I guess they were trying to get a piece of the Balkans for themselves, and they invaded Austrian-Hungarian territory, instigated the Battle of Transylvania on August 27th. Basically, it invaded and was quite successful until the Germans, along with their Austrian-Hungarian allies, counterattacked, and by September 18th forced the Romanian army all the way practically almost out of their own country. So that was a pretty big mistake on the Romanian part. They didn't gain territory, but lost a shitload of their own, including their capital. And by December of that year, they had lost 250,000 men and 2/3 of their territory. So that was definitely a mistake on their part. And by January 16th, the Germans were noticing that the Americans were getting a lot more interested in the war. So they tried to do what they've been doing for about 20 years now, trying to get Mexico or Japan to kind of piss off the Americans so that they would have to deal with them instead of Europe. So a Foreign Secretary, Arthur Zimmerman, sent a telegram to his ambassador, the German ambassador in Mexico, instructing him to ask the Mexican government to sign an alliance with Germany and basically start a war against America. Now, the Mexicans were horrified by this and promptly sent the message over to the Americans, and actually when that was found out by the American public, there was a bit of an outcry over that. I mean, how dare the Germans try to instigate a war between us and Mexico? So all that did was further piss off Americans against Germany. Now, at the start of 1917, things were going pretty damn bad in Russia. The Germans were invading Russia, just kicking their ass left and right, taking province after province. And finally, Russia had had enough, and cleverly or not, the Germans released a prisoner that they had been holding captive, one Vladimir Lenin. They released him into Russia. They thought would kick up revolution, and of course it did, starting the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. So on March 15th, Ides of March, no less, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated, and a provisional government was appointed. So that was a pretty big deal. End of the Russian monarchy. and the birth of the Soviet Union, more or less. Well, I guess more of the start of the Russian Revolution between the socialist Reds and the conservative Whites. That would be a bloody civil war, killing millions and millions of Russians. But Germany had succeeded in more or less knocking Russia out of the war. Now, on April 6th, the United States had finally had enough and declared war on Germany, much to the joy of the British and French, who by this time had basically had enough on the Western Front. They'd been living in trenches for about 3 years now, so you can imagine how bad things were getting on the Western Front for the Allied soldiers. So to finally hear that they're going to have support from America coming, they had to be overjoyed. Now the British again started their grand offensives. The Battle of Arras, I guess is how you would say it, began, and that was a pretty big battle for Canada and the rest of the Commonwealth countries. And they were able to gain a lot of territory, but then naturally they were halted by the Germans. And this offensive cost the British about 160,000 men and Germans 125,000. Then on April 9th through April 12th, you had the Battle of Vimy Ridge, which was the grand hoorah for the Canadian Corps, because that was their great offensive and they were able to capture Vimy Ridge. But they lost a lot of men in the process, and the Germans, they didn't think it was that big of a deal. In fact, they didn't even try to recapture Vimy Ridge. So, yeah, that wasn't a big deal in their opinion. Then to the south, the French began the Nivelle offensive on April 16th through May 9th, which was supposed to be, the last great attack that's going to end the war. So French soldiers were pretty happy and energetic about it. But when the offensive began, it just went to shit overnight, really. So, I mean, they were getting mowed down by prepared German defenses, and I mean, just morale plummeted, and large-scale mutinies among the French army, French soldiers. Almost half the French army rebelled against their French officers, so this was a big deal, very big deal. But the French general's command did a pretty good job not letting on, because if the Germans had known this was going on, they would have absolutely attacked. In fact, the Germans didn't find out about the mutinies until after the war, so I mean, things were so bad in the offensive. I mean, the offensive was supposed to basically end the war within. The French offensive was supposed to break through the German defenses in 2 days and only lose about 10,000 men. Instead, they ended up losing 187,000 men, so you can imagine. They were pretty pissed about that. And I guess one thing I kind of failed to mention back in 1916 was the advent of the tank. Basically, the tank came about when they noticed that tractors with treads did pretty well over the muddy ground. And they figured, well, if we slap some armor on that and a big gun, maybe they can get through no man's land in one piece. And the reason why it was called a tank was because British intelligence didn't want to let on to the Germans what it was. So they called it a tank, basically meaning something that carried water. So the first battle that saw the tank was the Somme offensive, and didn't do too well there. I mean, it got bogged down in the mud, and none of them really reached their goals. Yeah, the French started making their own, and they even had 128 for the Nivelle offensive. Of course, they lost 118 of them, mostly to breaking down and stuff. So yeah, tank wasn't really kicking ass yet. Now, what happened after the mutinies, Field Marshal Robert Nivelle was sacked, and his replacement was General Philippe Pétain, who immediately set to restoring French morale and confidence in their commanders by basically halting all offensives and promising the army that there would be no more suicidal attacks and that there would be more home furloughs and rest for the soldiers. Of the 3,400 French soldiers who were being court-martialed for mutiny, 554 of them were sentenced to death, but most of them had that sentence commuted. So, I mean, it sucks that some were executed, but, yeah, sometimes you have to do that to keep an army fighting, especially in these hellish conditions. In fact, the Nivelle campaign, or Nivelle offensive, just specifically the Chemin des Dames sector would be the last level you would play in the Valiant Hearts game. So, so basically the French army after that basically took a sitting and waiting approach. Pétain said that I'm waiting for the tanks and the Americans, basically. And the French were developing the new Renault tank, which was a light tank. It was fast, and only had a 2-man crew. And it was pretty good looking tank, so he was waiting for that and the Americans. Americans basically promised to send at least 1 million soldiers over. And you have to remember, this point in time, the American army was basically non-existent, so this was really a kick in the ass to us to get our military going. Now, while all of this is going in Africa, there's kind of a guerrilla war going on with the German army fighting the Belgians and Portuguese and British soldiers down there, led by a brilliant general whose name was Paul-Emile van Lettow-Vorbeck, who was basically with the 14,000 army, mostly made up of native Africans, who was having to deal with about 300,000 allied soldiers. So he would go on to be celebrated. After the war, I read a story of how, he was really a rock star, along with Hindenburg and Ludendorff. In fact, he didn't even surrender until after the Germans did. But a story I read about him later on was that, he was a pretty good guy, He loved his African soldiers. He didn't care if they were black. He was really one of the few European officers who weren't racist by today's standards. And when Hitler came into power, he offered Vorbeck him a job as ambassador to England. And Vorbeck, and very, ballsy, basically said Vorbeck told Hitler to go fuck himself, literally. That's what he said to Hitler, because he did not like the Nazis and what they stood for. So Vorbeck was definitely a badass. So while he's running around dodging 300,000 soldiers in Africa, in the Middle East, British officer T.E. Lawrence, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, was leading an Arab revolt against the Ottoman Empire, helping out the British army basically invade the Middle East. So that was pretty cool. And eventually the British army would take Palestine and, more importantly, Jerusalem. So that was a pretty big deal. Then with Lawrence's help, they would go on to take Damascus and many bases and cities like Aqaba and stuff like that. Lawrence would go on to be very famous after the war, especially his book, Seven Pillars of Wisdom. Oddly enough, Lawrence would be killed in 1935 riding a motorcycle through the English countryside. He He was driving pretty fast, and out of nowhere, two boys on their bicycles came out of nowhere, and he swerved and crashed, went flying over his handlebars, and basically got a serious concussion and died 6 days later. Oddly enough, one of his doctors would go on to promote the motorcycle helmet in England, so that was a pretty big deal when that happened. Definitely check out the movie Lawrence of Arabia. Definitely one of the best war movies of all time. Now, in July 1917, the Third Battle of Ypres began, better known as the Battle of Passchendaele. That was a big battle for the British and Canadians. About 200,000 casualties apiece were suffered in that battle. Now, in the south, the Italians had joined the war on the Allied side, and so they were fighting the Austrian and Hungarians in the Alps. So, basically, imagine World War I on a mountain range, like the Alps. That's how crazy that war was down the south between the Italians and them, the Austrian and Hungarians. So, I was getting a little crazy down there. At the Battle of Caporetto, which took place between October 24th and November 19th, was a pretty big battle, which the Italians basically lost an entire army to the Austrian and Hungarians. It's probably the biggest victory of the war for the dual monarchy. They only lost about 70,000 men, but basically took out 600,000 Italians. So the Italians were kind of having a rough time of it, but they would eventually turn it around and push the Austrian and Hungarians back. Now I'm going to kind of make a pivot to mentioning the air war that was going on in the Western Front. Yeah, we all know the Red Baron and stuff, and I'll get to him later, but the leading Allied ace of the war, and still is the leading ace of aces for the Allies, basically meaning he, outside of Germany and Japan, he's the greatest fighter ace of all time, was René Fonck, a French aviator who had 75 kills in the war. Supposedly his kill number could have been 100, over 100, but basically the way you got a kill in the war was if somebody actually saw you shoot down the enemy plane and saw it crash, or found the wreckage of it, so they were only able to find 75 of them. Now, he was a typical kind of arrogant French officer, but damn good pilot. Now, also on the individual soldier front, a very well celebrated German soldier, Ernst Junger, who I've mentioned before on the podcast, was basically entered the war as a private in 1914. He had been in the French Foreign Legion before the war started, but when the war started, he came back to Germany and enlisted in the war. He saw his first combat in 1915 and basically just worked his way up the ranks, and he was in most of the major battles of the war on the Western Front. He would be wounded about 14 times. I remember one time he was shot through both legs while running, so imagine how serious that was. And he was awarded the Iron Cross First Class, and he was the youngest man ever to be awarded the Pour le Mérite, which is the highest decoration in the German army. I think too the prettiest medal maybe of all time too. It's a very pretty one. Too bad it's not around anymore. And he would go on to lead stormtroopers in the Spring Offensive, and he would basically be knocked out of the war there when he was shot in the chest. While laying in his hospital bed, he got word that he was receiving the Pour le Mérite, so that was pretty cool. He was the youngest ever to receive it, and fittingly enough, when he died at age 93, I believe, he was the last man living to hold the medal. So he was a very, very interesting man, and he wrote a very damn good book, Stahlgewehren, in English, Storm of Steel. So that was a very good book. Alright, so back to the war. Now in 1918. March 3rd, Leon Trotsky signed the peace treaty with Germany, basically taking Russia officially out of the war. On March 21st, the Kaiserschlacht, or the Spring Offensive, began on March 21st, and that would continue through July 18th. Basically, when Russia took itself out of the war, Germany was able to bring about 1 million men to the Western Front, from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. So now, for the first time, they had numerical superiority on the Western Front, about 5.1 million soldiers. So they knew that they had to attack now because the American army was coming. So they knew they had to attack now. So they basically gathered up all the men they could, all the artillery pieces they could, and the wee hours of March 21st, they opened up the largest artillery barrage in human history until World War II, when about 6,500 artillery pieces fired. Now they fired about 3.5 million shells, I believe, in the span of 5 hours. In fact, Winston Churchill was in the trenches, and he wrote when the barrage started, he could tell right away that this was something big. This was something really, really big. So then after 5 hours, German army stood up out of the trenches for the first time in 4 years and started marching forward. And Ernst Jünger in his book talked about this moment that with each step, the army, you could just feel in the air that they were just getting angrier and angrier, thinking about all the brothers they had lost and just all the hell they had gone through over the years. You know, you had guys carrying like 10 grenades, guys carrying war clubs, they got their trench knives. I mean, they're good to go. Some few guys even had the MP-18, the first submachine gun ever made. Their job was basically run into a trench and just clear it out. So these German soldiers were ready. And the stormtroopers were the elite of the elite. Basically, the best soldiers of every unit were taken and put into the stormtroopers. So they were ready to go. Unfortunately, stormtroopers led the way, so they suffered pretty high casualties. So you were basically losing your best men up front. And eventually, after a couple of weeks, I mean, the assault was going well. Couldn't support themselves logistically, and they went past the range of their artillery, so they were just taking more and more losses. In fact, in 6 months of doing this, the German army went from 5.1 million men to 4.2 million men, so they were taking it pretty hard. And the logistics of this were pretty rough. I mean, you couldn't carry enough food and ammunition through no man's land, and it was just tough. And the Allies were able to eventually halt it. In fact, the British commander, Douglas Haig, sent out a order of the day to the British Army, and it basically went like this: to all ranks of the British Army in France and Flanders, 3 weeks ago today the enemy began his terrific attack against us on a 50-mile front. His objects are to separate us from the French, to take the Channel ports and destroy the British Army. In spite of throwing already 106 divisions into the battle and enduring the most reckless sacrifice of human life, he has yet made little progress towards his goals. We owe this to the determined fighting and self-sacrifice of our troops. Words fail me to express the admiration which I feel for the splendid resistance offered by all ranks of our army under the most trying of circumstances. Many amongst us now are tired. To those I would say that victory will belong to the side which holds out the longest. The French army is moving rapidly in great force through our support. There was no other course open to us but to fight it out. Every position must be held to the last man. There must be no retirement. With our backs to the wall and believing in the justice of our cause, each one of us must fight on to the end. The safety of our homes and the freedom of mankind alike depend upon the conduct of each one of us at this critical moment. So that tells you the kind of men that are standing up to the German onslaught. Alright, so on April 21st, 1918, Baron Manfred von Richthofen, better known as the Red Baron, was killed. He was the leading fighter ace of World War I. Very interesting man. Kind of a cool guy, you know, Red Baron. He shot down at least 80 airplanes. His death was kind of odd. Nobody entirely knows what happens, but it looks like he was shot down by Australian anti-air units, anti-air machine gunners. So he received a full military funeral by the British, who were the first ones to get to his body. And supposedly his final words were kaput. So pretty interesting last words there. The bullet basically went through underneath his right armpit and came out by his left nipple, so you could tell that gunshot wound had to just tear the shit out of his torso, just tear up all of his organs in there. So it was kind of surprising he was able to kind of crash land his airplane the way he did. So a few days after that, on April 24th, 1918, you had the first tank-on-tank action in history. 3 British tanks against 3 German tanks. Surprisingly enough, though, the British tanks won. They were able to drive off 2 German tanks, and another one of the German tanks basically tipped over and was taken out of commission. And now, by April of 1918, America was really getting into the war now. You had who would go on to be our top fighter ace of the war, Eddie Rickenbacker. He was a pretty cool guy. He was a race car driver before the war, and basically joined up and went on to become our best fighter pilot. He would shoot down 26 German airplanes. And after the war, he would go on to have a pretty good career being a military consultant and a pioneer in air transportation, especially when he was the head of Eastern Airlines. So he was a pretty badass guy. In July 1918, the Romanov family, basically Nicola the Tsar's family, they were all killed by Bolsheviks. Pretty brutal thing that happened, especially seeing how there were a lot of children involved being killed and bayoneted by the Bolsheviks. Definitely look into that some more. And on September 26, 1918, the Meuse-Argonne offensive began, and that was the big American attack that we launched against Germany. In fact, it was the bloodiest battle in American history. Too bad not too many people know about it over here in America. We would lose, basically we attacked with 1.2 million men, and we would lose about 26,000 Americans would be killed, 95,000 wounded. So that's definitely the bloodiest battle in American history. French lost about 70,000, the Germans 120,000. It's also the first battle that the BAR would be used. A World War II buff would know that rifle. In the middle of the battle, a certain Sergeant Alvin York became famous when he basically single-handedly killed 28 German soldiers, captured 32 machine guns, and 132 German soldiers. Basically him and just a couple other American soldiers. So he would go on to be the most decorated soldier of the war. In fact, I think when he was being awarded the Legion d'Honneur, which is another very pretty medal, by French Marshal Ferdinand Foch. Foch actually told York that what you did was the greatest thing accomplished by any private soldier of all the armies of Europe. So pretty damn high praise there. So he would go on back home and become famous, and actually all the money he got from his fame, he'd actually donated it to his hometown and his church. So he was a pretty interesting guy. And there would go on to be a pretty good movie about him called Sergeant York, starring Gary Cooper, I believe. So that was a good movie. So now we're getting to kind of the end of the war here. On August 8th to the end of the war, the Allies began the 100 Days Offensive, and that's when they hit Germany with everything they had. Now Germany was kind of on the ropes. I mean, they were back home, they were starving because they couldn't get enough food in because of the British blockade, naval blockade. And I mean, they were just on their last legs. So that's when you hit your enemy with everything you got. Still, I mean, the 100 days were pretty bloody, though. I mean, the Allies lost about 1 million men. Germans about 1.1 million men. So things were pretty rough. A lot of battles fought in that time period. A lot of stuff going on. But everything leading towards the end of the war. Then on November 9th, to basically avoid the noose, German Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated, and a German republic was proclaimed. And the next day, the Austrian-Hungarian Kaiser Charles I abdicated too. So they basically fled to neutral countries. Then the next day at 6 a.m., Germany signed the Armistice of Compiègne, and basically stated that truce would begin at 11 a.m. that morning. So the war ended on the 11th month of the 11th day at the 11th hour. So with that, it was over. A lot of trenches when they heard the news. Everybody erupted into celebration. Both sides would march into no man's land, shaking hands, celebrating. Other sectors of the battlefield, not too much was going on. A lot of hard feelings there. In fact, Eddie Rickenbacker was flying over the no man's land when it happened, and he noticed that it was very calm and peaceful, and then the celebrations broke out, and he said that he would never forget that moment. So that was pretty cool. So the war ended. I'm not going to go into the Treaty of Versailles because that's kind of a separate matter. I mean, that's basically what would lead into World War II, but right now I just want to kind of stick with the war itself right here. Now, the Allies mobilized about almost 43 million soldiers in the war. They lost about 5.5 million were killed, 12 million wounded, 4 million missing. So they suffered about 22 million casualties in the war. So over 50% of soldiers in World War I were casualties on the Allied side. So picture that, 22 million. Now the Central Powers of, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Empire, so on and so forth, had about 25 million men. They lost 4,386,000 killed, 8,388,000 wounded, 3,629,000 missing. So they lost about 16 million men. So they suffered about 16 million casualties during the war. And also the loss of several empires. The German Empire collapsed, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire collapsed, the Ottoman Empire collapsed. I mean, the map was redrawn. And you can see that a lot of problems that we have in the world nowadays go all the way back to World War One. Now, also in the meantime of the war, they also had the 1918 flu pandemic, which was called the Spanish flu, which was a unusually deadly outbreak of influenza, which killed anywhere from 50 to 100 million people. It was basically spread because you had soldiers coming from all over the place and just, spread it around. So, I mean, you had people dying in Russia from it. You had people dying in Kansas from it. So, really terrible pandemic. So then in 1919, you had the Peace Treaty of Versailles, and that was pretty controversial to say the least in Germany because they lost a lot. And they thought they could have probably gotten a better deal, but they were stabbed in their back, they felt, by the politicians, and some of them thought by the Jews. So that would instigate a lot of unrest and give rise to the Nazis and Adolf Hitler. A lot of people, I think, try to downplay it somewhat, that World War I was just a prelude to World War II, when I think World War I was pretty damn important event in its own right, not just because of its affiliation to World War II. Fittingly enough, you could just say they were the same damn war. Yeah. World War I never really ended. It just took a breather for about 20 years. So with that, I hope you learned something, and if you like this, check out our other episodes. They're a lot more funny and humorous. It may be entertaining, but I hope if you listen to this, you learn something, and feel free to go and learn the stuff on your own, man. I mean, trust me, I learned a hell of a lot more on my own than I ever did in school about history, so check it out if you're interested. Tons of good books, tons of good movies, tons of good games about World War I, so I just wanted to do this for the centenary of World War I starting, and kind of showing my appreciation to the memory of those men that I, for one, did not forget you. So take it easy to the listeners. Take it easy, and we'll see you next week.